I also would like to see the Indian tribes maybe audited and dismantled, because I think by following the money and the networks within the Indian tribes, you're going to see really the full essence of these international bankers and what they have done to us. Like the tributaries all lead out from them into the Bank of International Settlements to the major investment banks.
Maneko 64, home of alternative economics and contrarian views. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Susan Bradford. She's the author of some very interesting books. And today we're going to focus on her latest book called Taking Back America. Hi, Susan. How are you?
Hello, Mario. I'm doing very well. Thank you so much for having me today.
You're welcome. And as we go forward, I just want to share with the viewers some of the books that Susan has written. There's one here called The Tribes That Rockefeller Built. You've got The Royal Bloodlines. You've got The End of Globalism. Jack Abramoff, Rothschild, Zionist, and the one we're going to cover, of course, today is her latest, which came out, I think, 24th of July, Taking Back America. You can find it on Amazon. Yes, Susan, I've tried to inform the public more about the monetary system, how it's been compromised for a few hundred years by the bankers, the people that you identify as well as having a lot of power. So before we go on to your book, maybe talk a little bit about your background and where you've been and what you've found out over the years about things that they don't really seem to be what we think they are.
True. I'm originally from California. I earned my bachelor's in English from the University of California, Irvine. And when I was working as a journalist there, I wanted to learn more about the European Union, because that was when I earned my BA. That was around the time that the Rothschilds were launching the European Union as like a template for regional markets around the world. And I wanted to learn more about it so I could maybe go into to become a foreign correspondent. So I earned a master's in international relations from the University of Essex, and that was my first real, I think, dive into the knowledge about the proverbial deep state. The Essex was very much plugged in to that structure. I founded there the editor, the European Review, which brought together commentary and manuscripts from heads of state who are talking on both sides of the European integration, economically, politically, strategically. And while I was working at Essex, I was able to join the Atlantic Council as a senior research fellow. And I worked afterwards as a speechwriter for Michael Howard. And then eventually returned to the United States, where I worked as a producer for Fox News Channel, and I held a few other media positions, Simon's editor for The Voice of America, and I also wrote speeches for the Korean ambassador. But for me, I really became to understand how corrupt the system was. I think up to that point, I was very idealistic. I believed in globalism in the sense that we were taught at the university level that we would have a great unfolding of democracy and free markets around the world, greater prosperity, human rights, rule of law. But when I began working in the Abramoff investigation, I discovered that Jack Abramoff, who was the most notorious lobbyist for the Bush administration, that he had been set up for criminal prosecution on trumped-up allegations. And what was surprising about this is that the FBI and the Department of Justice and media knew that they were trumped up. There was very clear evidence that the allegations contrasted with the paperwork. And I endeavored to find out why the entire political establishment went after this one specific man. And what I uncovered is that Jack Abramoff was actually a key actor, I guess, in bringing forth this deep state. He had worked in Republican politics for many years. He had helped he worked on behalf of the city of London, overthrowing governments in Africa, with Soros to implant, puppet regimes. He became a lobbyist for Microsoft, and in that capacity, he helped implant the reformers in the former Soviet Union, who, like Yeltsin and his team, who eventually created the oligarchs. The oligarchs were created in part not only from stealing Russian assets, but with money from our federal government by way of shock therapy that was led by Larry Summers. And then the actual scandal began for Abramoff in Florida, and this was over an alleged fraud regarding his attempt to acquire a casino fleet. What I had uncovered by kind of looking into the background of that case is that Abramoff's team was working with a bank connected to Microsoft. The attorneys were connected to the Rothschilds, the Seminole Tribe of Florida, which in turn was had been seeded by Meyer Lansky, the founder of the National Crime Syndicate, and whose attorney for that casino was being bankrolled by Donald Trump. So there was entire, network of interest in which Abramoff had willingly taken the fall for these people. So he would be left holding the bag, they would be covered. And after he had served his time, he then went back into business with these people, worked with them to launch this cryptocurrency. His group had been involved in promoting Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, and then they were connected to the technocrats who were, involved in a lot of what happened during the Trump administration. So my hope was that if I could maybe bring forth this information, that we might be able to maybe restore some integrity, to the process, if we can understand how we got to where we are, how the system is broken, and maybe we can forge some solutions.
Yeah, and I'm not an American, but I went to school in Brazil, to the American high school. I went to university in the States, and I like history, and I always remember that George Washington, he warned, I think in his farewell address, of not having political parties, that it could always cause problems, and that it could be used to basically distract the public from the real problems that the country has. And I don't know if you've read this book, The Nameless War, by Captain A.H.M. Ramsey. He was an MP during World War II, and he was put in prison for his views during World War II. And he talks about the creation of the Bank of England in 1694, and he says that what the international bankers that created that institution decided to do was to create a the political party system in Parliament in order to keep people distracted and at each other's throat, so that they don't look at the real problem, which is this system where a few individuals and central banks can just create currency out of thin air and control the nation by inflation and deflation. And I think it was Thomas Jefferson who said that. So it seems to me that, reading your book, there's so much proof there that maybe Hollywood is not really the entertainment capital, but Washington, D.C. And it's all political entertainment. And I know I'll probably upset quite a few people who are pro this or pro that, but it seems like they're all they're all puppets or pawns in the game, so to speak. So maybe you could go deeper into that, and then talk about also how they use the Indian tribes in the U.S. to do a lot of the I would say money laundering. A lot of it's not just, they're not just using the Ukraine people, they're using other institutions that no one really thinks about.
Yes, and this kind of political party system, I think this was set up as part of like Hegelian dialectics, so that you think you have two viable options that will kind of fight against each other, and the outcome is always to further the agenda that they want. So, for example, at Preston Gates, which was Microsoft's lobbying firm on record, the senior Gates was a partner of that firm, Bill Gates' father. On the one hand, the Republicans would promote a specific agenda. They would raise money off of that agenda. The Democrats, who are maybe aligned in who were working with the politicians within that same firm, would represent the opposing side. They would raise money, and then they would have a very public clash in the media that was funded by very high-profile media campaigns, and each side would be sufficiently outraged to be kind of rooting for their team as if it were a sports game, and then ultimately they would achieve the results that they wanted. Another, I guess, a very specific example of this is that the Republicans were actually behind Obamacare, even though that's been painted as a Democratic issue. Before Obamacare, it was called Romney Care. The Republican Party, specifically Abramoff's team with Tom DeLay, they were representing Eli Lilly, one of the leading pharmaceutical companies that bankrolled the churches that were promoting Obamacare through the pew and mobilizing their congregants to actually lobby their representatives for the passage of that legislation. They were also, representing the pharma, which is the number one pharmaceutical lobbying firm, and they would I saw, during the Trump administration and afterwards, while they were kind of lining themselves up to receive money and to get government contracts for pharmaceuticals, for vaccines, they were publicly expressing outrage. Oh, the Democrats are doing it. They're the ones who want to lock down the country. But you could see that 6 months prior to even the arrival of the pandemic, the Republicans, like Eric Prince, for example, were working with the state governments to shore up money for the government's response to the pandemic. Like they were making sure that they were recipients of that of whatever money was to be dispersed. So I think this duopoly is very much theater. As you said, it's like Hollywood. It's very much theater of the two sides appearing to be fighting for their respective constituents, but ultimately they both serve the same elite at the top, the international bankers. Now, you had also mentioned the Indian tribes. When I was working with on the Abramoff investigation, I discovered that the people who were driving the investigation, it was a group called Stop Predatory Gambling. And I thought, well, that's interesting. Abramoff was he was working to block the spread of gambling on behalf of his tribes, so his casino-rich tribes. So it's curious that kind of organization would be targeting him. What I found out is that Stop Predatory Gambling was very much in line with the Rockefeller foundations. And so they were working on behalf of the Rockefeller affiliated casinos. And as I began to delve deeper into this, I discovered that the Rockefellers had established the federally recognized Indian tribes on land that were rich in oil and mineral rights. They wanted to kind of shore up the minerals. And that these came into being after the passage of it was the Glass-Steagall, which separated commercial and investment banking, but it also opened up banking ledgers to the federal government inspection. So in order to maintain privacy, they created the tribes that, like the Bank of International Settlements, cannot be audited, is not subject to FOIA requests, cannot be taxed. And so they were able to kind of have all this wealth, natural resources hidden behind the walls of the tribes. The leaders eventually became the representatives between the Indian tribes and the federal government, generally were representatives of oil and energy companies. They established a kind of a very much of a tyrannical system where the Bill of Rights were suspended. The tribes were also the means through which the City of London had hoped to project social democracy into the United States. So it was through the back door of the tribes, which were used as petri dishes for these different social programs. So in addition to kind of setting up a structure for their own financial agenda, they began to provide Indians all sorts of products and services. So by treaty rights, they were guaranteed medical care, housing, and health care. But these began to expand. So every type of product and service they could conceive of, they would offer the Indians, have the taxpayers support that. In turn, they created vast, very lucrative taxpayer-supported markets, closed markets. By the 1970s, 1980s, they began to rewrite tribal constitutions, often illegitimately, illegally, and then bring on a lot of individuals who were not Indian into those welfare roles, of tribal roles, so they too could expand their markets. Indians were then redefined, not based on blood quantum, but on being a member of a federally recognized Indian tribe. You could be, any race and be an Indian. So I guess once they had established the tribes, they then sued the federal government for the loss of the land for the Indians. These tribes, in turn, they were paid out over, I think, $1 billion by way of the Indian Claims Commission. Whatever money was not redistributed into private hands was shored up within the tribal councils. It was meant to be distributed to tribal members, but instead, in most cases, it was shored up within the tribal council. And then that in turn provided the seed money for casinos. And so you would see casinos being propping up on hundreds of Indian tribes across the nation. The first tribe to acquire the casino was the Seminole tribe of Florida. This is one that was seeded by Meyer Lansky, who was the head of the International Crime Syndicate. He had also worked with Resorts International in Atlantic City, which was a Trump-affiliated casino with Tibor Rosenbaum, I believe, who worked with the Bank of International Settlements. And the Seminoles, in turn, advised all of these tribal casino or Indian tribes on how they too could acquire their casinos. And what you discover is that a lot of the tribal leaders had joint bank accounts with AT&T, MGM, these different corporations, and they were taking the money out the back door and providing it to the corporations. This, in turn, became part of this international theft. As Nixon launched the fiat currency, more money was spent on the Indian tribes. No matter how rich they never became self-sufficient. They would demand more and more lucrative contracts from the federal government to the tune of millions of dollars apiece, in the hundreds of tribes across the nation. I think I also discovered that after the casinos arrived, that some of the money was diverted by way of Sumitomo Bank in Japan, and it made its way back to Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley, furthering their mergers and acquisitions departments. And that's when they both decided to go public. They then outpaced the competition. Nobody knew where the money came from. It did come from the casinos. And so I don't know if that's a place to start, but that the Indian tribes were really the means through which social democracy was brought to America, and this really began the shadow deep state that very few Americans were aware of. But it was really the subversion and, in my opinion, the theft of our resources.
Yeah, and you said that the Rockefellers they kickstart this program around the time of the it was 1933, the Glass-Steagall Act.
Correct.
So it's been around for a long time. Could you maybe explain how the bankers, on Wall Street and the City of London, how they've exploited this the Indian tribe situation? For example, have they been able to lease a lot of the land for resource extraction? Is that what they do? And also, all the money from the gambling, from the casinos, that must be flowing. That must be helping liquidity in the financial system. I mean, I've heard people say that one of the reasons the U.S. went into Afghanistan after 2001, well, we're told it was because of 9/11, but even though Afghanistan was not involved in that, but it helped keep the liquidity going, because once the Americans were there, the poppy fields started growing again. So it seems like you've got the same kind of thing going on right under Americans' noses, and no one knows about it, which is quite amazing. The Indian tribe situation, and it looks like it was the Rockefellers, and some people speculate that the Rockefellers were financed by the Rothschilds through the J.P. Morgans. I mean, J.P. Morgan Bank started out in London, so maybe you could, yeah, talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So the Rockefellers had originally mobilized the Baptist missionaries to kind of corral the Indians onto land that were rich in oil and mineral rights. And since they were working behind Baptists, very few people suspected, that there was a more nefarious agenda. So what you would see is that the Indians would claim mountains or land that they would say was connected somehow to their ancestry. And once they acquired that land, and who could deny the Indians and the exploited Native Americans who had been violated by the federal government so many times, betrayed by them. So they could very easily acquire those assets. And then once they acquired, a sacred mountains, sacred territories, you would find that the energy companies would then come in and begin extracting the minerals. And oftentimes they were able to acquire the minerals pennies on the dollar. They could then sell those minerals on the market for as much as they could get. During this time, they also lobbied the federal government to roll back federal oversight. They would say, well, these are sovereign nations. They have a right to govern themselves. They don't need to have the federal government meddling in their affairs. So as after the energy companies had extracted the minerals without really paying proper dividends to the Indians, they would come back decades later and then finance lawsuits to compensate the Indians for all the resources that they had stolen, claiming that the federal government lacked oversight. I've seen cases where the Indian tribes have claimed in the hundreds of millions, and I think it could even be billions of dollars through these lawsuits. The tribal members might make $100 a piece. The lawsuits would span decades, and then you'd find that the lawyers would make out with hundreds of millions of dollars, and then behind them would be the same energy companies, that had extracted.
And the taxpayer would be funding all of this, of
They'd
course.
be funding all of this.
I mean, it's just crazy. Yeah.
And they would say that since the cases really lacked merit and would not have withstood discovery, they were often settled in the federal government, like in Congress, where many of those politicians were on the payroll of these corporations by way of campaign contributions.
Yeah, and coming forward a bit, because the title of your book is Taking Back America. I mean, I read your whole book, and I learned things that I didn't know about. The general idea is pretty much what I thought, that you can't really trust either side of the political aisle. But maybe you could talk a little bit about, because there's so much division right now between Democrats, Republicans, Trump. Maybe open people's eyes a little bit about who's really behind Trump, and how, not much different than the other side Trump is, and his family, and even cryptocurrencies and Sam Bankman-Fried. I mean, I thought it was interesting last year when the whole story came out, and that he had been siphoning billions from the exchanges, that he was last year. Prior to that coming out, I'd never heard of him, but he was at a conference in, I think it was in the Bahamas, and he was sitting next to Bill Clinton and Tony Blair. So it seems like these people, they're just playing us. And the more they do that, the less people focus on the fact that, yeah, they're they're ramping up the debt, they're inflating the currency, not just in the U.S. but here in the U.K. as well. Maybe you could talk a little bit about what's happening nowadays to do with what happened in 2020 to 2022, even though we have to be careful what we say, but also with the whole climate agenda. That seems to be just another distraction, another strategy to try to extract more wealth from us.
The client extraction reminds me of the Carlyle Group, and they were formed by way of Alaskan Native corporations. That and there's another story there of their role in launching the working with Kissinger to launch the petrodollar and to blocking our economic security, but they had sold their tax liabilities, for which their businesses had been subsidized by the taxpayers in the first place, but since they were operating on a loss, they sold their tax liabilities, which then David Rubenstein, the founder of the Carlyle Group, picked up and sold on the market for millions. They were able to make so much money from the exploitation of the Alaska Native corporations that they launched the Carlyle Group, which then became a multi-billion-dollar private equity firm and government contractor. And what most people don't know about that the plans for those arrangements had been set up during the Nixon administration when Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney were running the Office of Economic Opportunity. And they in turn worked with the Carlyle Group to make their own money, to generate their own wealth through those arrangements. But to go back to Trump, his launch, I really start my exploration of his background in the 1980s. And during, I guess maybe the 1970s, when he was introduced to Roy Cohn, and who was a lawyer for the mob, a blackmail artist. He was introduced to Roy Cohn and then Roger Stone, who became his lobbyist during the Nixon administration. And Nixon, of course, launched the fiat currency, which then unleashed the federal government to be like a printing press for money around the world. One of the greatest recipients of that wealth was the Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos, the dictators who made billions of dollars from our money. When they fell into legal trouble, Trump's lobbying for the firm that he used to protect his casino interest in Atlantic City was also defending the Marcos family, like from all this money laundering. And I was able to show how Trump worked with Adnan Khashoggi, who was the handler of some of that the money movement. And after the Nixon administration, Trump, when he was plugged into these networks, he tried to launch a career or as a casino mogul, starting at Atlantic City, where he acquired Resorts International, operating the business at a loss. And among the financiers in Resorts International were the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, again, Tibor Rosenbaum for the Bank of International Settlements connected to the Mossad, and Meyer Lansky, the head of the International Crime Syndicate. Trump was not able to make ends meet, but he was bailed out by Wilbur Ross, who was an attorney and advisor for the Rothschilds, bankruptcy advisor. So Wilbur Ross had bailed him out. But you can see as you kind of follow the progression that these individuals with around the Rockefellers and the Rothschilds and their affiliated interests were kind of rigging the game, rigging the market to them for themselves. So, for example, after with the end of the Cold War, the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, was facing economic devastation. The Bolsheviks had really looted the country of its assets. So the federal government had decided, in its infinite wisdom, that that they would build back the very country that had determined that we were to be destroyed by way of communism. Wilbur Ross, the gentleman on the screen, he had worked with the Clinton administration to help open up channels for federal investment into Russia. The shock therapy, that was one of the strategies that was used to help the oligarchs shore up the wealth, was facilitated by Larry Summers, who would later show up as the president of Harvard. He worked with Jeffrey Epstein and these other individuals involved with kind of moving money around and compromising individuals on behalf of the Rothschilds. By the end of the Clinton administration, Trump had attempted to acquire the Seminole tribe of Florida, or helped to acquire a Las Vegas style casino for the Seminole tribe of Florida. Its chief competition at the time was the Sun Cruise. And what I discovered is that the law firm that Trump had, or I guess that he had enlisted, one of the law firms was Preston Gates. You know that because among the clients of Preston Gates was Icon Public Affairs, which employed Roger Stone, who represented the Trump organization, while Donald Trump was or his interests were working with Preston Gates. Preston Gates was representing the seller of Sun Cruise and also the buyer, which was its lobbyist, Jack Abramoff. Somehow, with these interests working within Sun Cruise, alleged fraud was injected into that deal. You can see that documented in the bankruptcy proceedings, and the loan, according to the bankruptcy paperwork that ultimately exposed the fraud in the deal and which revealed how the business was destroyed from within. You can see that the deal was structured to implode the business, to eliminate this as competition. Once this had happened, once the fraud had gone through, the Sun Cruise was eliminated, and the Seminole tribe went on to dominate the casino industry within Florida. They acquired Hard Rock, which has extensive ties to the City of London. They acquired Hard Rock for $1 billion. And then Hard Rock, in turn, had worked with various law firms to then allegedly, according to tribal paperwork, tap Indian tribes for assets. One of the tribes that it tapped, the Saginaw Chippewa Indian tribe, had reported a loss of $1 billion through that engagement. The connection with Abramoff, Abramoff was, of course, working with Microsoft. Microsoft, I hope I'm not pulling too many threads, but Microsoft was created by IBM after the federal government was pursuing antitrust legislation against IBM. Microsoft was kind of emerged as a competitor, but was still an extension of IBM. So you've got these corporations that are acting as independent actors, operating through proxy. You have like multiple competitors that all answer to the same ultimate financiers and corporate heads and financial interests. Once Trump became connected to Abramoff, he was in turn working with the very interests who were representing casino-rich Indian tribes, pharmaceutical companies, among the individuals, I guess, who was working with big pharma was Bill Gates. Bill Gates, in turn, had acquired access into China. He was developing a 5-year plan with the Communist Chinese military, Communist Chinese government. This was, this was a foundation that had been established decades earlier. He was also advancing an agenda that had been launched at the end of World War II. This was to elevate Communist China to leader of the New World Order while reducing the United States to a bankrupt welfare state. Somehow Microsoft became the company that was partnering with China to develop its technology. So Microsoft was also providing advice on all of these new technological tech firms that were emerging. Our pharmaceutical companies, meanwhile, had relocated from the United States over to China to take advantage of opportunities over there. I saw that during the Trump administration, these different kind of interests began to coalesce. You had the technocracy with Eric Schmidt, for example, who was also had grown out of these opportunities created by IBM. He was working with Jared Kushner to involve a track and trace system for the coronavirus. Jack Abramoff was working with Jared Kushner to launch a cryptocurrency with the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers. This was one that met the very specific anti-money laundering criteria that had been established after September 11th, 2001. The very pharmaceutical interests that had been championed and promoted by Abramoff were now in line to generate an incredible amount of profits. Trump also brought in the casino heads. I think it was Wynn, the fellow who ran Wynn was the fundraiser for the Republican Party. You had, of course, Sheldon Adelson, a leading Zionist, a casino executive, maybe becoming a major fundraiser for the Trump administration. Icahn, who had helped Trump with his bankruptcy problems in Atlantic City, was appointed to the Trump administration to work in regulatory affairs. So he was heavily involved with the Hard Rock deal. So you can see that all of these different deals that Trump had made, his financial interests, and that ultimately tied back to the City of London, to the Rothschilds, to the pharmaceutical companies. They all kind of coalesced within the Trump administration, enabling them to make a incredible fortune at our expense during the pandemic lockdowns.
Yeah, it's interesting because many people forget that the pandemic started under Trump's watch. And I remember a lot of people getting upset about the WHO. And then he said, well, I'm going to stop funding to the WHO. He said that in 2020, but he said it would only be done from 2021. And then in 2021, of course, Biden administration started, so they didn't do that. So I thought at the time, he's not really stopping the funding. He's saying he will. And the other interesting thing you pointed out was about the Carlyle Group, because I always thought that it came about because of the first Iraq War in the 90s, that I think it was Frank Carlucci, who was the head of the Department of Defense, I think, during that war. He started out the Carlyle Group, and George Herbert Walker Bush was involved. Even John Major was made, I think, European head of the Carlyle Group. I never realized that it actually started through the Indian tribes in Alaska. It was like a financial deal, like you said. And lo and behold, the most important guy now in finance, Jay Powell, he was a lawyer for the Carlyle Group. It seems to be I forgot that comedian, what's his name again? He passed on. He said, it's a small club and you're not part of it. I forgot his name now. George Carlin.
Oh, Carlin.
Yeah, but you talk about Trump and the fact that the track and trace was actually pushed by by his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, is it Eric Schmidt, the guy who found Google. What about the Democrats? They're involved. It's all just one big payola, so to speak. Are they all like because nowadays we hear that we're told by the mainstream or even by the alternative that the current administration, they're pro-Chinese, and that Trump is trying to fight the Chinese, trying to be friends. It's so confusing. Maybe you could clarify what's going on. I guess they're all just playing us, I guess, even China and the Russians. Maybe you can.
It is all a little confusing. During the Clinton administration, the Clintons aligned with Tom DeLay, a leading Republican, to push China through to the World Trade Organization to secure its membership. And then once it had secured membership, the Bush administration, which followed, then began to move all of our corporations over to China, and then they engaged in quantitative easing to create this false illusion that our economy was not being imploded. But the agenda goes back, I guess, to World War II, or so it was at the end of, I'm sure your audience knows, but at the end of the 19th century, the Rothschilds had determined in the city of London that they wanted to establish a monopoly on the wealth and power of the nation. By this point, the Rothschilds had kind of consolidated power around the British monarchy, the city of London. They were working with Yale University. Now, Yale University was established by it was Eli Yale, who worked for the East India Company. The East India Company was had been infiltrated by the Venetians. These were the usurious bankers and who had long ties, commercial ties in China, and were determined. Like they were really behind the negative British imperialism. Like they wanted to establish monopolies around the globe. They did so by way of genocide and other very harsh war revolutions. So during the I guess according to Yale's own research, Yale University had helped had mentored Mao Zedong, the leader of the Communist Chinese Revolution, who had also been mentored in the city of London by Bertrand Russell, who had also mentored Henry Kissinger. And so Henry Kissinger, of course, was appeared to be a conservative. Mao Zedong would be considered a liberal, but the goal of a communist revolution, it wasn't really to bring wealth or power to the people. It was a strategy that was being used to corral the wealth and power of the world within the hands of the few. So in a similar vein, the Russian Revolution was financed by J.P. Morgan, by the Morgan Surety Company, working with these same international bankers with a view to consolidating the world's wealth and power into the hands of the few. I guess the Bushes, the agenda really got gained momentum during the Nixon administration when they had launched the fiat currency. George H.W. Bush was appointed the liaison to China, and they had looked upon China as a vast market with unlimited potential. These were over a billion people who had nothing, and so they looked upon them as a way which they could exploit the cheap labor and have an unlimited potential for profits. And so they had determined that they would establish their template for the New World Order within China. They had controlled it, a secure control by way of revolutions and war. So behind this great Soviet menace, behind the great Chinese menace, are the same international bankers, both on the left and the right, who are bankrolling both political parties. And as you know, a politician uh, relies upon campaign contributions in order to be economically viable, in order to win the next election. So most of these politicians are on the payroll of the major corporations, the major investment banks, and they will inevitably serve the interests of these foreign powers because their livelihood and their political viability depends upon it. So they're no longer answering to we, the American people. They're serving these distant corporate interests. And I guess it's through successive administrations that these foreign powers have more tightly consolidated their control on the body politic. And I think since our own federal government has launched the fiat currency, we're just shoveling, billions of dollars out the door all around the world with no accountability, with no discovery of where it's going, and so forth. And then we're leaving the American people to hold the debt for this. And so in essence, the American people are becoming impoverished and they're being priced out of their own markets within the United States while, these foreign interests are acquiring our assets. And the foreign interests, of course, are ultimately answer to the international bankers within the City of London.
Yeah, and you talked about China, and some people might not believe that Wall Street and the City of London financed not just the Bolshevik Revolution, but also the communist Chinese. They played both sides, Chiang Kai-shek and Mao, and I mean, Cecil Rhodes, he started the Rhodes Scholars, and I think Bill Clinton was a Rhodes Scholar. He came to Oxford. But I saw this some years ago that there's a Rhodes Scholarship for China, and this is not Taiwan. This is for communist Chinese, and the people behind it is Schwartzman, who is the CEO of not BlackRock, but Blackstone, which is another private equity group. So, I mean, it's all in plain sight, and people still think we're being, it's a conspiracy theory. And the other thing, you probably have read up on Anthony Sutton,
I have.
the books he wrote about. Yeah, he wrote the Bolshevik Revolution, how it was financed by Wall Street and the city. He wrote about the Federal Reserve as well, and so I mean, this being election season, I mean, starting out in the U.S. I know it's next year, but there's a lot of talk about 2024. Even here in the U.K., we're going to have a general election, and it doesn't really matter who's going to win. They're going to keep trying to push this climate change agenda. And I don't know if you've heard of George Hunt. He's passed on, but he was involved in environmentalism, in the environmental business, and he attended the UNCED, I think UNCED conference, which was 1992, a UN environmental conference. And he said that the main drivers in the UN of this environmental movement were the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers. And you try to explain that to people. Do they really have the big bankers who control the money? Do they really want to help the people? And I say, no, I don't trust them. So maybe you could give your opinion on how we can fight these people, because it seems daunting, because they control so much. They've been able to divide us so much and fool us. Yeah, how can we take back not just America, but take back England and Germany and all the other countries that have been like compromised by the bankers and central banks?
I would like to see us as a people kind of come together and to remove ourselves from or at least be able to see through and not become attached to this left-right divide, and to align with each other as a people. You had mentioned the environmental movement. We had often portrayed Reagan as the great champion of freedom, but he had sat down with Gorbachev, the Russian leader, and he had agreed to converge the Soviet system with the American system. And it was under Reagan that Communist International was established in the United States, in San Francisco, through the Gorbachev Foundation. And it was the Gorbachev Foundation that launched the International Green Movement. And you can see that the green movement is being pushed by people like Larry Summers, who had helped the Russian oligarchs. They were working with Bankman-Fried. Even Summers was working with Bankman-Fried to establish permanent lockdowns, while they're also trying to promote or generate concern about global warming and ways that they could capitalize on global warming. I think in terms of solutions, I think more discovery, more transparency is better. I think once the public are able to see the truth behind all of the smoke and mirrors, I think that they will withdraw their support. Because most of what is being done in our name is being done, and what appears to be done fraudulently under color of law, and for the simple reason that we allow it, and we're not aware of what is happening within our midst. So I'd like to see us maybe become empowered through knowledge, which is what I'm trying to do by sharing knowledge. I also would like to see the Indian tribes maybe audited and dismantled, because I think by following the money and the networks within the Indian tribes, you're going to see that really the full essence of these international bankers and what they have done to us. Like the tributaries all lead out from them into the Bank of International Settlements, to the major investment banks. And I was also able to uncover what I believe to be a massive cover-up surrounding the Abramoff investigation. And I think that needs to be revisited and prosecuted properly with integrity, because it was the cover-up and the fraud that was allowed to fester, that was allowed to go on unchallenged, that laid the foundation for all of the other prosecutorial abuses that followed. So there was like one fraud that built upon another and another. And I think we have to go back to the foundation, route out the fraud, and restore integrity to our court systems and to our government. And I think we do have the evidence and the wherewithal to do it, but we need to have the popular and political will. And I think that would start through education. And from there, I think we, the people, can establish some type of a game plan where we can do this effectively, lawfully, peacefully, and reclaim our nations. And I think it is very possible for us to do that.
Yeah, I agree with you, and it might sound difficult, but that's what I try to do on the monetary and financial side. So just one more question that you've probably seen that there's a guy in Argentina who's come out of the nowhere, Javier Milei. I don't know if you heard of him. He won the presidential primary in August, and he's expected to maybe win the presidential election. And he's come out and said that he wants to destroy the central bank. He wants to destroy, socialism and the system that we have. Do you think he's just another puppet, or do you think he's for real? I mean, do these people allow anyone that they're not controlling to become influential, or am I being too cynical?
I think you are I think your cynicism is warranted. They invest a lot of money into harvesting our personal data, so they can understand where our concerns lie and then tailor political messages accordingly. And so if we were to support somebody like that, they could say, oh, that individual enjoys the will of the people, as Trump did. And I'm finding that many of these so-called reformers are bankrolled by the same individuals. Like they hone their message to us. It sounds very reasonable. We think they're going to take on the international bankers and the corrupt system, but they end up reinforcing and serving it. I think to really test his authenticity. You'd want to pay attention to his actions, and also to look into his history to see who is backing him, where did he come from, and if he doesn't have any financial encumbrances to that same system, he might be legitimate, he might be authentic. But I'm not sure that they would allow
Yeah.
such a person to
Yeah.
to
I
serve.
saw a picture of him from, yeah, granted, it was about 8 years ago. He attended a World Economic Forum event in Panama for Latin America. So, yeah, it's a little bit questionable. Do you want to, have you got something to say to the viewers, not just in the US, but around the world? And before we wrap up, and also maybe what do you think 2024, is it going to really solve any problems, or is it just going to perpetuate the current system? And do you see, because I think there's a lot of political division. They've been able to divide people really well, the Hegelian dialectic. And it's not surprising because our money system is so, we've had 52 years of fiat currency and it's on its last legs. Any views on that and how the politics will evolve in America and around the world?
My sense is that the system is coming undone. And I say that because I think through channels like yours and others, that people are increasingly becoming aware of the agenda, who's behind it. They're withdrawing their support. And I think that support is being withdrawn on higher levels too, not only among the people, but within the companies themselves. I think the agenda that they wanted to impose upon us has not happened. I mean, they're trying to push it in that direction, but with more disclosure and more transparency, I think that they are losing a lot of ground. So I would hope that that the people around the world will realize that we're not at war with each other. We're being pitted against each other by these international shadow actors who stand to benefit and profit through that division. So I'd like to see maybe more fellowship among the people of the nations, more transparency, and for us to kind of stand together as a people to push back in whatever capacity we happen to find ourselves in, and to do what we can. But I see the system crumbling. I mean, there's still a lot of momentum behind it, but I kind of see that it's kind of losing steam.
Do you think the BRICS are another construct of these, these international actors, or is it a genuine move against the system that is crumbling?
Brazil, I believe, is controlled by the Zionists, if I'm not mistaken. You have then Russia and India, which is also aligned with Israel. Russia is controlled really by the Rothschilds. Putin is a proxy for them, and China, of course, would be part of that. I think that they know that the Bretton Woods system has failed, but at the same time, I think they're trying to establish another system where they can dominate. I'm not sure that it would be a fairer system or one that serves the people, but it's one that would serve them as an alternative to the Bretton Woods. So that maybe we need to pay close attention to that. But isn't Saudi Arabia also trying to align with BRICS too?
Yeah, I think they were invited and they're going to join from the 1st of January. Saudi Arabia, Iran, the United Arab Emirates, Egypt, Ethiopia, and Argentina even. So
that would be the extension maybe of the Belt and Road Initiative, and which is really having China, control the global economy possibly. So I'm not sure if BRICS is a good thing.
Yeah, and I think I mean the globalists are probably, they're in charge of China. I mean, you look at the Rhodes Scholarship for China, and I think there was a fund manager that worked with George Soros, Jim Rogers.
Mm-hmm.
He moved to China or Singapore, that part of the world, over 2 decades ago, because for some reason he knew that China was going to become powerful. I wonder how he learned that, maybe from his old boss. And I'm not having a go at Jim Rogers, because he does say some things that help. But
And
so
of course,
yes.
Soros has also been has also invested in the Carlyle Group. Just
Yeah,
another.
they're all in it together. It's like yeah, like a club. So could you tell the viewers where they can get your new book and your older books, and if you've got also social media presence, if you could tell them where to find you.
Thank you. My website is susanbradford.org. And that page has, I will be putting up links from that page to Amazon, but all of the books can be found on Amazon. And I am building my social media presence. I am in the process of developing a Substack and a Gab, which will be linked to that webpage. But I do have a Gab account at Susan Bradford, and I'm in the process of really developing my social media, which isn't as good as it should be right now, but I'm in the process of putting
Great,
on.
great, Susan. It was really nice talking
You
with
too.
you, and yeah, keep in touch, and maybe we could do some other interviews if you'd like.
Oh, that would be fantastic. I really appreciate talking to you, and thank you so much for all that you're doing for the public and for your audience. I really appreciate it, and also for having me here today. I appreciate that.
Well, you're welcome, and thank you.